As a lover of all things story, I am under the impression that there are two elements to every story that just absolutely have to be on point, or else your story is probably not worth telling. Two elements that no matter what, they need to be there, they need to be right in there in order for your story to be amazing, to be remarkable, to be memorable, to be repeatable. Two elements that if they're not perfectly there or not placed in just the right way, your story runs the risk of being the absolute worst thing a story could ever be, forgettable. Those two elements, of course, are the beginning of your story and the ending. If the beginning of your story is not any good, then you run the risk of losing me before we ever really get started. I need to be given a reason to care about the characters that I'm reading about or seeing or watching or whatever in order to want to keep going on with the story. Or at the very least, you need to give me some sort of a compelling element, something that's just immediately grabbing my attention that makes me want to keep going to find out what's happening here. Man, if your ending isn't any good, you run the risk of getting rid of all the goodwill that's been built up of our time together throughout the whole story. You run the risk of me just not caring at all about wanting to ever hear this story again. If I'm honest with you, I think the ending of the story may be just a little bit more important than any other element that the story has to offer. This is true whenever we're reading a book or something. There's nothing more egregious than reading a really long book that's been really, really good, that's been gripping, that's been exciting, that's had all kinds of twists and turns and had earned humorous moments in it and all kinds of really great things, only for the ending to fall flat. I recently read a book that I was so excited about while I was reading it. I was engaged in everything that was going on to it. I couldn't wait to get home in the afternoon and just start reading into it because I needed to know more. I cared so much about this main character. I cared about her journey that she was on. I cared about how things were going to go, and I couldn't wait to see how it all turned out. Every chapter seemed to grip me deeper and deeper into this story to the point that I was staying up till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning to try to get more read. I wasn't very good that week at anything else I was doing, but I was reading that story like it was nobody's business. And then when I made it to the final chapter and everything was kind of building and culminating to this one major event, it had the most lazy twist I've ever read before in a book in my life. A twist that was so bad it destroyed the credibility of a really major side player, and it made our main character look like an absolute idiot the entire time. I was so angry and so upset about how bad this ending was that my immediate reaction was to maybe go ahead and throw the book in the garbage. I know, a totally rational response, right? I was so excited about it. I was ready to just, tell everybody they need to read this book because it was so good. And then when that ending happened, I wish the book had never been made at all. Movies can be just as bad at this sort of thing, right? I mean, there's nothing worse than watching these trailers for these movies and finding out that this is a great director, that you like their work, that it has the actors that you love to see, and that the story about it seems so awesome. You build up months and months of anticipation, sometimes even years, because they decided to delay your movie a whole other year. It's really frustrating. But to be so excited about this particular thing that's going to happen, and then you get to the movie, and the movie's great until it gets to the ending. Because then the ending feels rushed, or it feels forced, or it feels unearned. And then all that anticipation that you had, it feels like wasted time. And yeah, with a movie you can go and you can ask for your refund or your money back, but even if they give it to you, you can't get back the time that you spent. You can't get back the 2.5 hours you watched the movie. You can't get back the months of buildup and excitement that you had for it. But as bad as, again, books and movies can be pretty bad. If the ending's not there, those can be terrible. And those can be really frustrating. But as bad as they are, I think TV shows might be just a little bit worse. Right? If you've watched a TV show for years, you've invested in it. Every Thursday night, you are there, glued to your screen. 8 p.m., you know it's time for whatever your TV show is at Thursday night at 8 p.m. NCIS? I don't know. A lot of you guys seem like an NCIS crowd. But you're so excited about it. You're invested in these characters. You've spent years watching them grow, watching them develop. You've laughed with them. You've cried with them. You've seen all these big moments in this character's life. And then you get to the final episode. It's not as good as you were hoping for. It's not the ending that you felt like you needed to get. It's not the closure you hoped that this would bring. It's gotten to the point, honestly, where as a viewer of television and stuff like that, when a show that I enjoy announces that the next season is going to be their final season, I get a little nervous. I get a little nervous about whether or not we're going to get a great last episode like we did with The Office or with Parks and Rec, or if we're going to get a lousy final episode like we did with Seinfeld or How I Met Your Mother or The Sopranos or Lost or Roseanne or The X-Files. Man, there's a lot of really great TV shows that just have horrible last episodes. And the problem with that is that last image that you get of that show that can be so bad that it taints the way you feel about the show forever. You may want to go back and rewatch some of it, but you know that ending's coming and you kind of dread it a little bit. It's bad when your ending is not good. It can ruin everything for you. But we know in our own lives that oftentimes the stories that we tell about our lives don't have the endings that we want them to have. We know that there are certain elements of our lives that no matter how much we try, no matter how much effort we put into, sometimes there are outside forces that change the ending for us. Maybe the story of the best job you ever had, the job that you absolutely loved, that you couldn't wait to get up in the morning and go to work, maybe that story ends with you being fired out of nowhere. Blindsided by that sudden change of this. Maybe that story of the relationship of the person that you cared so much about, that you envisioned spending the rest of your life with, that you made plans, that you pledged to spend the rest of your life with, maybe that story ends with a bitter divorce. Maybe the story of you raising your kids and loving them and investing in them and doing everything you can for them, maybe that ends in you never speaking to them again. Oftentimes the endings that we have in our own lives, they're not the endings that we had in mind. I know this to be a fact in my own life. As much as I love being here, and please don't misunderstand, I love being here. I love being your pastor. I love being your minister here. I loved my time in Illinois. I loved my time as a youth minister there. I loved those kids. I loved all the trips that we went on. I loved all the little different things that we had, all the inside jokes. My group had a lot of inside jokes. For instance, we refer to ourselves as the Island of Misfit Toys because none of them were like the top jocks or athletes or anything. I had a group full of nerds, and I'm okay with that. I miss those nerds. But as much as I loved my time there, when I felt God was leading me to come here and to come be the minister here at Macedonia, and I felt that transition happening, I had an ending in mind. I had this amazing way that I was going to close out my time with this youth group. It was going to be meaningful. It was going to be poignant. It was going to be awesome. And then COVID hit. And my last youth group with that group of kids was over Zoom. It wasn't the ending I wanted. It was frustrating. It was angering. I'm getting emotional right now thinking about how mad I was that night as I hit end meeting and our time was done. It wasn't the ending I wanted it to be because sometimes we just have to live with unsatisfying endings that we didn't plan. And I can't help but wonder for Samuel if his ending was exactly the way that he wanted it to go. Because honestly, I have my doubts that this was the ending that Samuel planned for himself in his own life, in his own ministry. I mean, the last several years of Samuel's life had been kind of all over the map, right? He had led the nation of Israel for a long stretch of his life as their judge, and he had led them and ushered them into a time of peace that was so great that the historians never found anything that was worth writing down. Again, we could look at that and be disappointed because they didn't tell us about all these amazing stories in Samuel's life, but imagine living in that time of peace. Whew. No reason to get excited, stressed out, angered, anxious. I'd love that. I'd love that for like 6 months. That'd be fantastic, right? They had it for years under Samuel. And then when Samuel's told that he's getting kind of old, which is just a fun thing to tell somebody, right? And that his sons aren't the people that he raised them to be, and now all of a sudden everybody in Israel wants a king so they can be all like all the cool nations have. All of them got a king. We want a king too. I think every parent has heard something along those lines, right? Maybe not a king, but he had done that. He had lived with that disappointment of these people not kind of rejecting him in a way. But God reminded him, they didn't reject you, they rejected me. And so Samuel went and he anointed the king of all of Israel, believing that maybe the Saul guy is going to be it. Maybe he's the answer. And then he learns firsthand that Saul doesn't have the one thing that a king of a nation founded by God should have: respect for God's commands. Kind of a doozy. And so Samuel lived with that despair. He lived with that time. He mourned over Saul until God says, "Get up. I got somebody else I want you to anoint." And we talked about last week how God in a moment showed Samuel that he had a plan beyond Saul for Israel. And that when Samuel anointed David to be the next king over Israel, God gave Samuel what he needed most in that time: hope. Hope for the future. Hope that things are going to get better beyond this time. Samuel's probably not going to live to see it, but that hope is still there nonetheless. And I think it's at this point that Samuel decides, let's call it a day. I think it's at this point that this is the ending, that Samuel is like, you know what, if I got to go out, this is probably the best spot I probably can go out on. And I feel that way because in 1 Samuel 16, verse 13, we get a picture of Samuel trying to make a graceful exit. I didn't get the slides up on the thing, so sorry. You're going to have to actually open your Bible today. But in 1 Samuel 16, verse 13, it says, "So Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on David from that day forward." And then it closes out with this line. It says, "Then Samuel set out and went to Ramah." He's anointed the Lord's next chosen king over all of Israel, and he's riding into the sunset like John Wayne. It's a great ending, isn't it? I just had this one poignant moment with God where my hope is absolutely and unequivocally restored. I've set the path for the future of the nation of Israel, the nation that I love, that I've invested my entire life into. It's time to call it a day. So he goes home. I love that ending, don't you? There's just one problem. His story ain't over yet. As much as Samuel would probably like that to be the lasting image of his time in Israel, of him just riding off into the sunset after anointing yet another king, that's not the end of the story. And in fact, the way that Samuel's story kind of ends, it ends on a pretty weird note. In an event that makes absolutely no sense if we start to think about it. He's probably gone off to Ramah. He's spending some more of this time just trying to figure out what all is happening. He's not invested in what's going on in the way that he used to be. He's not the head guy like he used to be. But he's probably keeping tabs on Samuel and David and what they're doing. He's probably got people who are just sharing some of these stories about the David and Saul saga, which is a really, really interesting saga. And yet Samuel's just kind of off to the sidelines. He'd spent most of his life in the background, and this time it seems like he's very much okay with that. But again, that's not the end of his story. See, over time, Saul becomes pretty jealous of David. David becomes really, really popular with the people almost as soon as Samuel is done anointing him, because not long after that, the very next chapter, we see the most famous story, possibly next to the cross in all of Scripture, as David kills Goliath. This young man beats this giant. It makes me nervous whenever I see a kid with a slingshot. David does this, and we see even more stories of him being a very proficient and effective soldier. But not only that, he's got the heart of an artist, as he's actually in Saul's house, and he's there to play the lyre, again, which is an instrument that's very similar to a guitar, which if you're a master at playing the guitar, it can be beautiful. David is not only a proficient artist, he's a proficient warrior. He's kind of got the whole package, and on top of all that, he's a pretty good-looking kid. And Saul begins to notice something. He begins to notice that David is becoming more and more popular amongst the people of Israel. In particular, he's becoming pretty popular amongst the ladies. In fact, there's a little song that the ladies like to sing. We see it in 1 Samuel 18, verse 7. We see some of the lyrics. It says, "As they danced, the women sang, 'Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands.'" That's a catchy beat, right? It's like Taylor Swift wrote it. My goodness. This is the song that's so popular that they're ascribing tens of thousands of deaths to David because he's so proficient as a warrior. And Saul looks at this as seeing, maybe they're going away from me. Maybe they fall in love with David. Maybe they want to make him king. He becomes so jealous of David that Saul tries to kill him. few times. He tries over and over again. He tries in some pretty creative ways at times. But when the king of the entire nation is actively trying to kill you, what choice do you have but to run? And David needs to run somewhere where he feels safe, with people he knows are going to protect him, with people he knows are going to be around him. So it really shouldn't surprise us that David first went headlong into Samuel. He went straight to Ramah to go to the prophet, the man of God, the former judge of all Israel. 1 Samuel 19 verse 18 tells us about their reunion. They have not seen each other since the day Samuel anointed him. And we read that David fled and escaped and went to Samuel at Ramah and told him everything that Saul had done to him. And then he and Samuel left and stayed at Naioth. Now, I want you for a second to try to put yourself in Samuel's shoes here. Samuel has more or less retired. He's kind of enjoying his time to himself and kind of just, reaping the reward of all the work that he has accomplished. And he had such a great ending to his entire time there, a perfect ending for himself. And now here comes David with a problem. And Samuel's got a choice here. He can choose to tell David, hey, get off my lawn. He could do the old man routine if he wants to. Because if he takes David in, if he goes off and tries to hide David from Saul, the most powerful man in the nation, the king over all of Israel, and if Saul finds out, Samuel's risking his life. He doesn't have to. He had the ending to the story that he wanted, but Samuel knows something that I don't think the rest of the nation of Israel knows about David. See, because when we hear about David being anointed, we know that he was anointed in front of his brothers, but the whole country doesn't know about that. So Samuel knows that David is God's chosen next king. That this young man is supposed to be the next leader of all of Israel, and if the current leader of all of Israel tries to get rid of him, that could be a problem. God has a plan for Samuel to still help out. And regardless of how old he is or how long he's been retired, it's been a couple of years at least at this point since he left David behind. Yet God still has more for him to do. Samuel thinks he's done. God says, I'm not finished with you just yet. And we get this kind of weird image about how things go, because Samuel takes David to a town called Naioth. And when they get there, it gets kind of unusual, at least in our interpretations of some of this stuff. We see what happens in 1 Samuel 19, verse 20. It says, Then he being Saul, sent agents to seize David. However, when they saw a group of prophets prophesying with Samuel leading them, the Spirit of God came on Saul's agents, and they also started prophesying. Now, real quick, when you and I hear the word prophecy, we have a tendency to think of predicting the future, right? Am I the only one who does that? I once heard a gentleman who, when George W. Bush was still president of the United States and there was a Supreme Court justice seat that had emptied out, I'd heard a guy say, well, the Lord spoke to me and told me that George W. Bush is going to replace a Republican judge on the seat. Now, I don't know much about politics, but I know that George Bush was a Republican. And typically, if you're on one side of the fence or the other, you want guys in power who are on the same side as you. That's not much of a prophecy, bro. I think that's called common sense. But we tend to view prophecy as being this predicting the future type element, and yet, when it came to this particular notion, the Hebrew word that's used here is actually meant to convey more spontaneous and joy-filled worship. Now, these groups of guys that are here, they are actually just worshiping God in the midst of this. That they're all together and they're having this time of worship. In fact, traditions of Israel tell us that this group of prophets may have actually been a group of musicians who were known for going from town to town and worshiping God and teaching people different songs. So Saul sends these guys to Naioth, and they get around this group of prophets who are all singing and praising God, and they join in. That's not what Saul sent them to do. He sent them to go get David. He sent them to go get rid of this whole thing and get this all over with. And so this group comes in, they start worshiping instead. So Saul gets frustrated. He sends another group. Same thing happens. He sends a third group. Now you could probably guess how it's going to go by here. Worship can be kind of contagious, can it? Kind of dig that, don't you? Those moments where the Spirit of God is so permeating around us that we can't help but worship. And then it causes others who maybe weren't there to do that to worship as well. How cool is that? So then Saul finally decides, you know what, I got to go. My guys aren't getting it done. I'm going to take care of this. If you want a job done right, got to do it yourself. So as Saul comes to Naioth, as he enters the city, the same spirit of prophecy comes on him, except it's a little bit different. It's a little bit, I'm just going to use the word, it's a little weird. It's a little weird. Because we read in 1 Samuel 19, verse 24, Saul then removed his clothes and also prophesied before Samuel. He collapsed and lay naked all that day and all that night. That is why they say, is Saul also among the prophets? Yeah, I read that right. Saul, the king of all Israel, the guy who's in charge of leading this entire nation, has just come into town trying to get rid of his rival, and he's stripped naked. This is the first time that Samuel has seen Saul since he told him that God has rejected him and that his lineage is going to end with him. They've not seen each other for years. And now when Samuel finally sees Saul one more time, he sees all of Saul. And he's just lying on the ground, naked as the day he was born. There's got to be at least some part of Samuel that sees this whole thing taking place, and he just has to think to himself, I mourned for this guy? That's weird, right? Does anybody else think this is weird? I think if you come across anybody who's just laying on the ground naked in front of you, you're going to think that's a weird day. But then that's just kind of it. Like, that's just how this story ends. Right? Because David takes the opportunity while Saul had got the Spirit of God overcoming him and he's laying on the ground naked. David says, well, I'll just take my exit now, and he leaves. And Saul eventually gets up and I really hope gets dressed and goes chasing after David. And Samuel just sort of goes home. What a weird ending, right? This is not exactly the ending that Samuel had envisioned for himself. This is not exactly the ending that you and I would have given Samuel, I don't think. And yet this is more or less how it ends for him. Because the next time we hear about Samuel isn't until chapter 25, and it's not until the very first verse, where it says Samuel died, and all of Israel assembled to mourn for him, and they buried him by his home in Ramah. And David then went down to the wilderness of Paran. If you would, for a moment, think about that verse. I'm not trying to highlight this to you because I think this verse has got some deep spiritual meaning to it. I want you to think about this particular verse. I'll read it one more time for you. Samuel died, and all of Israel assembled to mourn for him, and they buried him by his home in Ramah. David then went to the wilderness of Paran. I want you to consider this verse. But I want you to consider everything that we know about this man. Consider the mom who was so desperate to have a child that she went and pleaded before God over and over again, saying, if you give me a son, I will put him in service to you. Think about a boy who grew up in the tent of meeting, in the assembly, where all of Israel would gather together to worship God. Think about a young man who heard the voice of God speak to him, possibly for the first time anybody had heard from God in years. And what God had to say wasn't exactly a real positive message about Israel or about his father figure. And yet, in spite of how difficult that was, Samuel still told Eli about it. Think about a young man who, after Eli dies and the Ark of the Covenant has been taken and removed from the heart of Israel, he's thrust into a position that he may not have been completely ready for, but that he spends his entire time trying to do everything that he can to push the nation of Israel to finding their way back to God. He's able to get them to get rid of idols, probably generational idols, idols that have been in the family for years, and he's able to get them to throw them away so that they can serve God. A man who, again, led them to a time of peace that was unheard of in this time. A man who has now anointed the two kings of Israel up to this point. A man who has given everything to God and pointing people towards him. And that guy doesn't even get a whole verse to himself on his death. He doesn't even get the whole verse. He barely gets a sentence to himself. He's thrust in the background of a book that bears his name. And his own death can't even get a whole verse to itself before it's, well, Samuel died. Now here's what happened to David. Let's get back to what matters now. If I could be honest with you, I got angry. When I read this, keeping in mind everything that we've learned about Samuel, as I studied his life and I found out that this is the ending he gets, I got so upset. This guy gave everything to the nation of Israel, doing everything that he could to make sure that they all got back with God, that they were the nation that God had always intended them to be. And he can't even get a whole verse to himself when he dies. And yet, the more I've thought about it, the more I've invested into this, I think Samuel himself would probably be okay with that. I think Samuel himself would probably be all right with the idea that his eulogy is just a sentence long. I think he's okay with that because, again, this is a young man, or this is a guy who spent his entire life pointing people towards God. Not pointing at himself, not saying, look at how great I am, not saying, look at how amazing I am, not saying, look at how powerful my words are. He spent his entire life pointing the nation of Israel to God, to get them back in line with him, to do whatever he could, to get as many people as he possibly could, to know who God is, to know the love and the compassion and the grace that God had for this nation of Israel, to do everything they could to be set right with him. Yeah, Samuel spent most of his life in the background, but most of the time he was trying to do it to point people towards God. And so I got to think that he wouldn't want a whole chapter dedicated to how he died or what his last words were, or what his last meal was, or any of that stuff. Save that for somebody else. Because Samuel gave his entire life in devotion towards pointing people to God. If there is one lesson we can glean from the entirety of Samuel's life, a guy who we've now spent 6 weeks talking about, if there's one lesson that I think he would want us to get, it's that it ain't about us. And that kind of hurts us a little bit, doesn't it? Because whether we want to admit it or not, there's always a part of us that kind of wants to be the center of attention. We want people focused in on us. We like to be the, as I've put several times, the hero of our own story. We live in a culture and a society that is always about taking care of number one and prioritizing us over all else. And yet here's a man who spends his entire life saying, no, it's all about God. A man who's relegated to the background of a book that bears his name because it ain't about him. Our goal as Christians, our goal as followers of Jesus and the love that he has and the grace that he has for everybody around us, our goal should be to do everything that we can for as long as we possibly can to point people towards him. To say, look at how great our God is, not look at how great I am. To say, look at how amazing it is what Jesus did. than to say, look at how amazing it is what I can do. Our goal as Christians is, was, and should always be to make sure that we're doing everything possible to lead people back to God, to help them find Him, to know the warmth of His love, to know the freedom of His grace. I don't think it's coincidence that the last thing that Jesus said before He went up to heaven was for us to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's what our goal is. That's what our purpose is. No matter what we can do, no matter what position in life we're at right now, whether we're just getting started, whether we're nearing the finish line, our goal, our work, our effort should always be to point people towards God. Samuel lived that mantra throughout his life. His mom could not have possibly foreseen the man that he would become, a man of God who wanted so badly for people to point towards God, that got upset, that mourned when a person who was placed in a position of leadership would not do the same. Samuel's entire life was about this one thing of connecting people with God. That is an example worth following, in my opinion. The Apostle Paul wrote a beautiful perspective that I think we would do well to keep, and that I think Samuel probably had a pretty close perspective to. We see it in Romans 14, verses 6 through 8, and we're going to close with it this morning. It says, "Whoever observes the day observes it for the honor of the Lord. Whoever eats, eats for the Lord, since he gives thanks to God. Whoever does not eat, it is for the Lord he does not eat, and he gives thanks to God. For none of us live for himself, and no one dies for himself. If we live for the Lord. And if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or we die, we belong to the Lord."